Good morning, and welcome to the first annual leadership meeting of the APS, an experiment in progress. We are adding to our usual leadership convocation meeting that is held every year in Washington at this time, a day in which we outreach to the public and to the government, and with news about the exciting developments in physics and the important policy issues that face physics and science and the world. This year we have invited, in addition to our APS leadership and board and council, representatives from science from around the world who will be talking today, and some illustrious speakers to start out with the science and the challenges to international collaboration and focusing on the obstacles to collaboration and the issues of competition. Scientists are extremely good at combining collaboration and competition in a harmonious fashion, but where now that harmonious mode of operation is being threatened on many fronts. And those are the issues we'll be addressing today with our speakers, who will both discuss some wonderful developments in science and that have been achieved through collaboration, and some of the challenges they face in the future. We will then have two panel discussions on collaboration and competition. Just some notes: you all received index cards when you came in. Those are to be used during the panel discussions, where we'll be having a wide range of issues brought up. And if you have questions during those panel discussions, please write them on the index card and pass them to people in the aisles. And if we have time, we will address those questions as well. You don't have to identify yourself, it'll be anonymous. But we're going to start appropriately with a keynote address by a good friend of physics, Stephen Chu, who you all know, a Nobel Prize winner for his work on atomic physics and now a distinguished biologist. He is also, as you know, has served in the government, the US government, as Secretary of Energy during the first Obama term, and currently is president of the AAAS. His title of his talk is Rising Above the Gathering Storm. Steve.
Thank you. So, I apologize for being late. I actually went to bed well past midnight, got up at 4, and I need another 2 hours. But I'm going to start with what I have. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about rising above the gathering storm and this issue about the benefits of open science and the real concerns of intellectual property theft. As you may know, this is a takeoff on something that I was part of in 2005, rather. A committee led by Norm Augustine issued this report, Rising Above the Gathering Storm, and several years later, Rising Above the Gathering Storm, approaching Category 5. Also, I was part of a report called Restoring the Foundation, the Vital Role of Research in Preserving the American Dream, and there will be a sequel to this one as well. A draft is circulating, but it's coming out soon. All right, so what are the issues? Let me show you that there's a growing concern about competition in science technology, industry, notably from China. This is some recent data of from 2000 to 2016 of Chinese expenditures and R&D relative to the United States, EU 28, Japan, Germany, and so on. But this particular graph stops at 2016. The reason why I'm late is I was actually running around gathering data to find out what happened in the years 17, 18, and 19, where it was reported there was a 14, 16, and 34% increase per year. So that puts us up there, or them up there. We are still where we are with about a 5% increase. So China is investing very heavily in R&D. Now, let me just step back a little and remind you all that China is a country comprised largely of immigrants. This is very much the lack of sleep. The U.S. is a country comprised largely of immigrants. And this brain gain of these immigrants has really been stimulated by some political events, what I call are gifts from Germany and Italy, and also other countries in the late 20s, early 30s, early 40s. When the communists took over in China in 1949, if you were an intellectual, if you were a PhD, you really had to escape because you would be killed. I know because my father's sister was a professor in China in Tsinghua in chemistry, believe it or not. She grew up, she had her feet bound, but she became a professor in chemistry. My father and my mother went to the United States during World War II to study at MIT, and in 1949 they had to remain in the United States. There's no way they could go back. My mother's father had to escape with his life in 1949. He was the president of a university. He would have been killed. They wanted to kill my father's father, but he died of old age before the communists got down to the Shanghai area. So they did the natural thing. They killed the oldest male child of the family that was still there. He happened to be 21. So it was not a good place for educated people. And so that was another gift. There were other gifts later on. Gorbachev in the post-Soviet Union allowed Soviet Jews to immigrate from the country, and they took off from 1989 to the mid-1990s. About 1.5 million, almost a million, went to Israel. The largest faction, maybe 400,000, 500,000 went to U.S., and the rest to Germany. And suddenly Israel became an intellectual giant, if you look back at your history. That was another intellectual gift. And all these scientists who came over, and many students began to come over into the United States, because they liked what they saw in the United States. It was a free and open society, and ultimately an accepting society. That's not to say that U.S. was always an accepting society. Immigrants, every wave of immigrants were actually kind of dumped on since the beginning, except probably the Brits. But in any case, they turned out to be a very open society. And certainly, for most people's experiences, my own included, if you're born, I'm a second-generation Chinese, that means I was born here in the U.S., you grow up feeling very much like an American. And so these first-generation people came and raised their families. Now, they did add a lot to the scientific and technological excellence in the United States, so I gathered some data. Turns out the 143 immigrants to the United States won Nobel Prizes, accounting for 34% of all the U.S. laureates, and 31% of them are in physics. It's hard to count the second-generation Nobel laureates because some of them don't identify themselves as being the children of immigrants. But my guess is, raw guess is it's close to 50% if you include the second generation. But anyway, so this is documentable, and it turns out that all the physics Nobel laureates of Chinese heritage descent are Chinese American. They're U.S. citizens. I was born here, but and so all of them were actually in the United States. It's staggering if you consider, this is data from 2007 to 2019. If you consider the dark green are the foreign-born U.S. laureates, the orange were native-born U.S. laureates, and that other light color are the rest of the world. The United States has done very well in Nobel Prizes. It's the first take-home message, but it's deeper than that. The foreign laureates out of the United States, dark green, and the orange and light green are the U.S., where the foreign-born laureates are staggering. As I said, the Nobel laureates in science and economic sciences, which is, I guess, a medal given in the honor of the memory of Alfred Nobel, not a Nobel Prize, was awarded to 8 Chinese Americans, 5 Japanese Americans, 4 Indian Americans. In 2019, 10 of the 14 Nobel Prizes in science and the prize in economic sciences were Americans. Half of those were foreign-born. In 2016, this really galls my wife, who's a Brit, born in Wales. 5 of the 9 Nobel laureates in science and prize in economic science were British-born U.S. immigrants. So we stole the Brits. Earlier on, we were not the powerhouse we are today. If you think about before World War II, bright young physicists, for example, were sent abroad to go to Germany to learn quantum mechanics, people like Oppenheimer. Clearly, they were there to steal the secrets and come back to the United States and seek economic dominance. So anyway, the U.S. foreign-born Nobel Prize winners parse out this way. It's not only that they helped in academia and science, but they also helped in the defense of the United States. And this is a smattering of the immigrants who actually worked on the Manhattan Project. Now, in this list of eminent physicists, a large fraction of them later became Nobel laureates. And this is a picture taken during World War II of the so-called metallurgical lab, which is part of the University of Chicago. And those red people, Fermi, Frank, Szilard, Wigner, were all part of the metallurgical lab, as was Glenn Seaborg. But these are the foreign ones. So a large fraction of the Manhattan Project, of the real brains of the Manhattan Project, were actually foreign scientists who somehow got security clearances because it was important for the defense of the country. Now, it's not only true in defense and in science and academia, but many foreigners came and founded companies. And it turns out that 45% of the Fortune 500 companies were founded by immigrants or their children. Many of these, I did not know Jeff Bezos was a second-generation Cuban. I did know Elon Musk was a first-generation South American, and Sergey Brin was born in Russia. Jerry Yang and Jensen Huang, Yahoo and NVIDIA founders, are from Taiwan, and so it goes. You could say that, now, there's something here. It kind of centers on science and founding companies, because when you're an immigrant, you actually don't have the social connections. And so you tend to gravitate towards areas where that is can put up with an accent in broken English, which is the universal language of science. Anyway, we teach it well in the U.S. So Fortune 500 firms started by immigrants. There's high-tech retail. I'm just reading down the list in case you can't read it. Finance, insurance, industrials, and so on. So, all right. So what are the concerns that we're here to talk about? And so I'm going to mention a few reports. And there's actually the report that I think, if you don't know, I recommend you all read all of these reports. And there was a recent report issued in December 2019 from Jason. It was commissioned by the National Science Foundation. And they first introduced it saying, well, you know, again, the United States has benefited greatly from all these wonderful students and science emigres. And so what was the charge of this committee that wrote the report, and what were their recommendations? I'm not going to read you all of this, but I'm just going to fundamentally paraphrase it. But it was a recognition that U.S. science flourished in an atmosphere of openness, and especially openness in fundamental research. And so I'm going to make a distinction between fundamental research, industrial research, or applied research, which is by and large not published, a large fraction is not published, and of course classified research. And so the real questions that they were asked to address was, okay, we benefited from fundamental research. What parts do we want to keep? But if we keep them, there's also these threats that are growing. And what do we do about those threats? And the threats are things that have recently been making the headlines and also has gotten the attention of Congress and the President. This started a few years before the end of the Obama administration, where there was growing concerns from Congress that perhaps certain countries, especially China, wanted to steal a lot of basic research secrets, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means in a second. And so they go on and talk about this and say there are signs, the Jason peeps in this Jason study, they found there are definitely signs that in addition to making wonderful contributions, point number one, point number two was the United States is one of the standard bearers in upholding the values of ethics in science, including objectivity, honesty, accountability, fairness, and stewardship. So we're one of the international group of countries, we're not unique by a long shot, that really subscribe to these principles. But that the Chinese government and institutions, some recent actions have raised concerns that not all countries, including China, are completely in line with these ethical values that we hold. And so this is the issue. The most important thing I thought the report said, well, they said many wise things in this report. I think it was a balanced report. But one of the things, the point 7 in the recommendation of the report, was that it should uphold this, what's called the National Security Decision Directive 189. So NSDD 189 was written as a directive during Reagan's administration. And it drew a clear distinction between fundamental research and classified research. And it defined fundamental research in this directive as the results which ordinarily are published and shared broadly within the scientific community, as distinguished from proprietary research and from industrial development, design, production, and product utilization. the results of which ordinarily are restricted for proprietary or national security reasons. Okay, so that's its definition of fundamental research. It's going to be published in the open literature. And it is the policy of this administration that, to the maximum extent possible, the products of fundamental research remain unrestricted. It is also the policy of this administration that, where the national security requires control, the mechanisms for control of information generated during federally funded fundamental research in science, technology, and engineering at colleges, universities, and laboratories is classification. No restrictions may be placed upon the conduct of reporting federally funded fundamental research that has not received national security classification, except as provided in applicable U.S. statutes. So this was a very, very clear declaration that if the research you are doing is going to be published in the open literature, there should be really no restriction on how that information flows. And the recommendation, one of the prime recommendations of the Jason report is specifically that the NSF should support reaffirmation of the principles of NSDD 189, which make it clear that fundamental research should remain unrestricted to the fullest extent possible. Okay. This is now being debated in Congress. Just so you know. And let me then show you a few other things. There's this IP commission. There's had one original report and 2 updates every other couple of years. I know about a third of the people on this committee. They are serious, good people, the ones I know at least. But it really goes on to talk about are some real threats in terms of taking advantage of perhaps an asymmetric relationship between the way the United States conducts scientific research and allows its scholars to disseminate and what is happening abroad. There's also a Senate report that came out again, I think in December of last year, 2019, threats to U.S. scientific enterprise, China's talent recruitment plans. Very different tone than the Jason report, but it's worth reading because it reflects, and it's considered a bipartisan report. Okay. Rob Portman, Tom Carper were the chairman and ranking member. In that report, the Senate report, a lot of its contents could be found in an earlier report dated September 2015, and it's an FBI document called Counterintelligence Strategic Partnership Intelligence Note. The acronym was SPIN, maybe with some irony, not being fully appreciated. But in any case, in this counterintelligence report, again, I don't expect you to read the fine print. It's unclassified. It's on the web. You might want to know, you might be asking yourself, what does FOUO mean, F-O-U-O, for it's something that's only for official use, but it's on the web, so lock me up. No. And it is unclassified. Okay, so what they're talking about is they're finding, the FBI is finding evidence among individuals that are being targeted to bring information back to China. It's not clear from this document nor from the Senate report how widespread this is. There are several anecdotal evidence instances which at least appear to be correct, But again, is it 1%? Is it 10%? Is it 10 to minus 4%? Don't know. Okay. But in any case, what they do is they key in on a few key technologies based on the China's 12th fifth-year plan, which says China wants to be leaders by 2025 in things like new energy, nuclear, wind, solar, energy conservation, environmental protection, biotechnology, new materials, new information technology, high-end equipment manufacturing, and clean energy vehicles. So these are, things that, well, I'll tell you in a moment, it brings back fond memories. Anyway, that's what China wanted to do in their 12th five-year plan, and they also want to go further than that. This is a repeat of this. So it brings back fond memories because I'm reminded of a talk I gave in November 2010, and it said, is the energy race our new Sputnik moment? Okay, let me remind you, on October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union put a little satellite about that big into orbit, and it was actually visible from Earth in the right time of night. And there was a bit of a panic and tizzy in the United States that the fact that the Soviet Union was able to put a satellite into orbit before the United States. So November 13th, a little bit more than a month later, President Eisenhower responds to this by giving a major speech. Okay, let me read you part of it. The Soviet Union now has, in combined category of scientists and engineers, a greater number than the United States. It is producing graduates in these fields at a much greater rate. The trend is disturbing. Oh, by the way, before I launch into this, let me remind you that Eisenhower was one of the two five-star generals, only two five-star generals in the U.S., and one might expect that a former five-star general might say, oh my gosh, we're falling behind, we've got to spend a lot of money on rocket research, missile research. Okay? He didn't. He says, he talks about the training of scientists and engineers, and he says, this trend is disturbing. Indeed, according to my scientific advisors, this is, for the American people, the most critical problem of all. My scientific advisors place this problem above all other immediate tasks of producing missiles, of developing new techniques in the armed forces. We need scientists in the 10 years ahead. Can you imagine this happening today? So, as a result of that, the United States decided to say, in order to keep our lead, our military lead, our security lead, we will invest heavily in science, and we will get more people in the United States trained as scientists. And my generation of scientists grew up in this Sputnik era where there were science programs galore. I was in a science program in high school, two science programs in high school, two in college, and so on and so forth. And many of us went into the science. I didn't. My father and mother told me I had to, so I had no choice. But, but many people said they went into science because of this. All right, so this is my talk of 2010. These are the actual slides. So I went on to say, innovation adds to the wealth of society. Science and technology, R&D, lie at the heart of innovation, and leadership innovation can't be taken for granted. I again talked about rising above the gathering storm and what was going on. I reminded the press club who were listening to my talk how we led in many technological innovations like getting the assembly line to work. Ford did not invent the automobile, the internal combustion engine, or the assembly line. He did what China did. He took those ideas and made them work better. Okay? So, the invention of the first transistor, integrated circuits, the first airplane, GPS, optical communications, the internet. All of these things were great innovations, and I was concerned, I said that for over a century, America has led the world in innovation. Today, that leadership is at risk. I pointed towards the loss of leadership of high-tech manufacturing base, and so on and so forth. And then I pointed to China's intentions, hoping to get the United States excited. This is my second year as Energy Secretary. It was actually, I was 1 year into it. And I quoted Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao in the World Economic Forum 2009 and said, we should see scientific and technological innovation as an important pillar to make greater effort to develop new industries of strategic importance. Science and technology is a powerful engine of economic growth. We will make China a country of innovation. We will accelerate development of a low-carbon economy and a green economy so as they gain advantageous position into the international industrial competition. Okay, so during that time, I was saying China thinks this is going to be the technologies of the future. They want to be leaders in this technology, so we better get moving so we can establish leadership. Anyway, I'm not going to go through this, but so that was in 2009, 2010. I was talking to Congress and giving public addresses talking about that. And what I was getting in response in the hearings was, no, we're not going to do anything. China's not doing anything. No, they are doing anything. By the end of 2012, they asked me, and again in hearings, they said, why didn't you tell us what China was doing? Why didn't you warn us? Now we're slipping behind in these technologies. So I went on to say America still has the opportunity to lead the world in a new industrial complex. I pointed to other things, the American Energy Council business, who again points a very distinguished group of people, Norm Augustine, Ursula Burns, John Doerr, Bill Gates, Chad Holliday, Jeff Immelt. So they also pointed to the loss of R&D, things of that nature. So I said, we face a choice today. Will we maintain America's innovation leadership, or will we fall behind? We must seize the opportunity, the innovation opportunity, and we can't afford not to. So it concluded we should formulate sensible long-range energy policies that have bipartisan support and increase support of R&D. Okay. Now, the response of the country was not what I hoped for. It's just like when Germany and then Japan started making better cars in the United States, the response is we'll put in a tariff and we'll lock them out of the US market. And they say, well, but then we're not going to buy US cars. Okay, but you're going to have to make them in the United States. But of course, they can't make cars in the United States with American labor force the way we can. So of course we'll win. Not so for Japanese and German companies in the United States. And in the end, you know what they did? They started making better cars. The US. Okay, it's the old Churchill saying, the United States invariably does the right thing after exhausting all of the possibilities. So I don't want us to go through the same thing again. The proper response to Chinese investment and Chinese ambitions in high-tech companies and science excellence and engineering and technology would be, hey, let's make ours even better and still stay ahead. Now, what's coming down the pike is that the Undersecretary for Science in the Department of Energy, Paul Dabar, said publicly, and this is a quote, "We're not saying that universities can't take money from these countries, China. That is their decision. But if you're working for the DOE and taking taxpayer dollars, we don't want you to work for them at the same time. Essentially saying, no, 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 you take our money, you take their money. You choose, one or the other. DOE employees are finding it nearly impossible to go to China for science conferences these days. And so these things are increasing. The NIH is becoming increasingly alarmed about academic secrets being stolen. This is basic research academic secrets. I think ultimately the reason is because they're afraid China would be faster at converting discovery science in basic biology into treatments. And therefore, we have to guard our basic science rather than saying, shouldn't we get better at translating basic science into medical treatments? But so the first posture is a defensive one. And of course, all the agencies are very concerned that if you are taking money from China or elsewhere, you have to declare it. I profoundly agree with that. You probably all heard that a very distinguished materials scientist, chemist, a friend of mine, Charles Lieber, has been arrested because he was taking lots of money from China, both personal money and funding his research, and he did not declare it to the various agencies. That is illegal, and so it was also shocking. And there are also other stories that appear to be true. A young postdoc trying to sneak some vials and socks of tissue cultures to China. That is, I think, those stories make sense to me as young, ambitious people, unethical people trying to get ahead by illegally getting a head start by taking materials or information. Now, if you're in a research group, in my research group, of course you're allowed to take the information, your data, your copies of your notes, the raw data stays, but everything, you're allowed to take copies of that, and in my group, you're not forbidden not to work on the stuff you worked in my lab over the last 40 years. Some labs forbid it. You can, it's like a non-compete clause. You're in my lab, you work in this stuff, you go elsewhere, you got to work on something differently. But in many labs, including my own, I allow that. It's different if these people are taking stuff they did not work on. Okay, that's a very different step, and it seems that some of this is happening. Anyway, the NIH has reacted by saying not only financial support or student support, but support in things that we consider significant, and in frequent answers to frequently asked questions, they just said anything that's not commercially available could easily be considered significant support, which includes those tissue cultures or cell lines or reagents, which, by the way, if you publish in Science and Nature, you're obligated, if someone else says, can I have your reagent or your this or that, you're supposed to give it to them. So that's the irony. The journals have used to open scientific discovery ethics, and they're not completely in line now with government agency policies. So this is something else that's of a concern. I only have a few more minutes. I'm going to stop. But before I do, I want to do one more thing. And had I not been late, or if I got up a little bit earlier, or maybe just not gone to bed, I wanted to tell you about something. This is a series of columns written by a Chinese physicist postdoc named Yang Chen, and she wrote this column called "Protesting in the Name of Science: The Legacy of China's May 4th Movement." And she describes herself as mother didn't want to go into science, but she says if you do, don't talk politics, don't participate in politics, don't ever join street demonstrations, don't do anything. And And so as a postdoc now, she's writing political columns. Well, they're scientific political columns. And she quoted someone, I believe that these two gentlemen can bring salvation from all the darkness in China. This is a speech given in 1919. To be it political, moral, intellectual, or spiritual. In support of these two gentlemen, we're willing to endure any oppression from the state or attacks from society. Even bloodshed and martyrdom are no reasons for abandonment. And the two gentlemen she was referring to are Mr. Science and Mr. Democracy. I'm going to finish now because David's looking very nervous. But this, she says, in Science and Democracy, these are going to be the pillars of going forward in any modern society. And she affirms how important both of those things are and how in more dictatorial countries you can lose this connection between science and democracy. And I do personally think that science only really flourishes over the long term in an open society. And if you're not allowed to have Google, your research is actually greatly impaired. I can personally attest to this. Without Google, my current research over the last couple of years will be much worse. Anyway, so she ends her column by finally saying, I went to my first political demonstration feeling a little guilty. She let her mother down. And it was this march for science, concluding, what does democracy look like? This is what democracy looks like. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Steve. That was a great introduction to the issues that will occupy us for the next 2 days. I cut you off in order to have some questions from the audience, and we have mics, and there are a lot of provocative issues that you raised. So, who would like to question Steve? No. Laura Green. Here, wait for the mic, please. Wait for the mic.
You mentioned the sad happening in Harvard and Lieber taking money from the Chinese. That's going to have tremendous repercussions to scientists all over the United States.
Right.
And what is your recommendation on how we should deal with it? It's the thing is that, you know, scientists are still a minority, and if there's a bad actor, everybody in that minority is blamed for that. And what's your recommendation on how we as scientists should deal with that?
Well, we should be declaring our support. We're required to declare our support. I was shocked that Stan did this. And the real fear is this really a one-off. No, there's like a couple more that have done this. And so because very distinguished scientists in the United States, okay, let me first start by saying what's behind it and why is China doing this? China's doing this is because they want those people to set up an outpost in China, but more importantly, they want to have access to what is being done in the top labs in the United States. Even though it's basic research, they will get a 1, 2, 3, maybe a 4-year glimpse into what's happening. So 1 to 3 years or 4 years before it gets published or discussed in a conference. And so during that time, you can kind of throw resources at it, try to catch up or even get ahead. And that's fundamentally unethical behavior, right? I mean, if it's happened to me a couple of times, merely by coincidence, you write a proposal and then before you get funded or something, the result mysteriously appears, And then after a couple times, I no longer write things that you can do in a year or two, once you've heard about it in a proposal. It's not like a big accelerated experiment where it takes 5 years to assemble a planning committee. So I think, this scientific unethical espionage occurs. It's not limited to China. It occurs all over the world. It occurs among Americans spying on Americans in these unethical ways. The question is, what should we do about it? I think we should, affirm the ethical standards. And one of the things in the Jason report is you should be an appreciation. These are the ethical standards science is going to flourish by. If you want to be in the scientific community, every country, every university should affirm these standards and say, this is what we believe in, and if a faculty member gets out of line in a particular university, has real conflicts of commitment in universities, these are things that are fireable offenses. And in some cases, worse than fireable, because if you lie to the FBI, that becomes a felony. So I think, I hope it's just one-offs and two-offs and something like that. But I think the way to do this is to get in front of this and say, you can't be signing agreements that says you're not allowed to disclose the contents of your agreement with your primary employer. This is what some of the 1,000 Talents programs are requiring people to do. If you get our money, you can't disclose that information. So that's nuts. That's simply, it's really easy. It's illegal. It should be, if it isn't illegal, it should be illegal. And it should be illegal to declare you can't have secret funding sources.
Thank you. Going along with her question about what we should do, I will tell you a little tale what happened with me last summer. I was in Europe for 3 months, as I do every year, and I was returning to my university in the end of August. When I came back, I had a meeting in China, which I was co-organizing. So when I came back, I found in my mailbox a letter of reprimand saying that I organized a conference in China, and this was a co-organizer was one of these talent seekers in China. I didn't know about that. And there was all the threats about being fired, DOE, losing my grants. I circulated this in the American Physical Society. I got emails, for example.
Excuse me, who was the letter from?
The letter is from the president of my university to me. It's a letter of reprimand because Texas A&M Commerce. So I circulated this letter through the American Physical Society. David Cross sent me an email saying this is ridiculous, but it looks to me that they are on the legal side because they are following the guidelines of DOE and what they tell you. But this is a very tiny little thing involving a few $1,000s to organize a conference, and people who are really doing basic science. It's nuclear physics. It's considered basic science theory. I really know what I did wrong and what to do, because apparently they are following the federal government guidelines. But this is really, I do not know what to do in this case. So it's more or less.
This sounds a little weird, and as I understand it, just so I'm going to repeat it, you were getting a few $1,000s to help organize a scientific conference. The money was being paid for the conference.
Right.
So that's certainly not in the spirit of what the concerns are that are rationally being discussed in Congress, right? I mean, I gave a talk on energy and climate change. It now has something to do with my research, but it doesn't have anything to do with my federally funded research. And you get an honorarium. Now, I happen to take that honorarium and donate it to my Stanford Research Fund. Now, is that unethical behavior? I don't think so. But, I'm beginning wondering to myself, if I get another honorarium, A big, much bigger one, I gave the AAAS, the American Association for Advancement of Science. Okay. But most people won't do that. They'll put it in their own pocket. Now, now the question is, will this be considered undue influence on scientists?
Just to be sure, I didn't get any money from anybody.
This proves the point, I think, that unless we police ourselves, our government is going to police us. And sometimes their actions will be sensible, and sometimes they'll be non-sensible. But Steve ended with, the scientific community has fostered openness and transparency over the centuries, and that's what's made modern science possible. But in order to make that possible, as we all know, in areas which have nothing to do with national security or IP, just ordinary scientific research, we have norms of behavior that we hold our colleagues to. If they steal ideas, we treat them differently, and that's how we enforce our norms. Now, clearly the best way to deal with these problems would be to police ourselves better, and I think we are moving towards that. The APS, indeed, has now set up a whole ethics committee with a statement, and we are going to be addressing that in a very clear fashion. But those social norms that are so important for science, reinforce them will take some time. I think it's important for us to try to convince our governments, and who know little about scientific culture, that this is of great importance to us, even in cases which have nothing to do with national security or IP. And that we got the message and are going to address these issues. I think that's one way of answering these charges.
Let me make a comment. This is more than abstract for me. It's actually become very personal. I had my last 5 postdocs left my group. 2 of them got assistant professors at the University of Chicago, 1 at Harvard, 2 at Fudan. It's typical of my group. What happened in Fudan is the Fudan people wanted to say, oh, this is great. We'd love to continue collaborating with you. And I said, okay, sure. But more than half of my former group members have very friendly relationships and collaborations. Bear in mind that they also need to prove themselves independent of me. But what happened to the 2 in Fudan, as soon as they got hired, it became a diode. They wanted to know what I was doing. They wouldn't tell me what they were thinking of doing. Virtually every other postdoc says, Steve, I'm thinking about doing this. Can you critique it? And we're all happy to say, oh yeah, that's great. And why don't you think of this? Why don't you think of that? Right? It's a total honest thing. I want them to succeed. But all of a sudden it became a one-way diode. It got worse than that. And I had set up visiting professorships for them and access to our Google Drive and everything. And after I found some of the stuff, I said, this is crazy. And so they're off to Google Drive. I'm about to cancel their visiting. I said, don't come back to Stanford until I can trust you again. Because they were doing some really crazy things, trying to delay a publication of data they took in my lab so that it could be published under Fudan University. And I said, no, it's not going to be published with you. It will be present address Fudan University. All the data was taken in my lab. The ideas were in my lab. This is the way it's done. So there are ambitious young people who become, and I will never collaborate with them, nor will I write a recommendation for them.
That's the way to do it. Steve, thank you very much. Great start. And so now we